Well, today on Practical Church Planting, we're talking about 3 reasons why you should understand your audience while preaching.
Welcome back to Practical Church Planting, where in 15 minutes or less, we'll give you practical tips, advice, and encouragement to help you plant and grow healthy churches. My name is Brian Androsian. That guy's name is Dylan Dodson. And today we're talking about 3 reasons why you should understand your audience while preaching.
So here's the deal. We want to communicate the gospel effectively and clearly.
True.
And to as many people as possible.
Also true.
And so we want to understand what's actually going on when we're preaching so that we can do that better. So we want to talk about 3 things for you to consider when you're preaching and who you're preaching to so that you can be more effective. Number 1, that understanding who you are preaching to will determine how you preach. Now, some of this may be, I knew that and I just forgot it, or something
right.
new. It just kind of depends. But we have to understand that who you're preaching to determines how you preach. So I'll give you an extreme example. But let's say you are speaking Spanish and everyone that's showing up to your church speaks French. Well, you're not going to...
Might be tough.
They're not going to understand what's going on,
yeah.
right? And so you need to understand who is actually coming so that you can be clear to how they're speaking. Now, different environments can do different things. So, for example, if you are preaching or you're doing a teaching or a talk for elementary school kids, well, you need to understand that elementary school kids are coming to hear you because you're going to teach to them quite differently than you would to a room full of adults, or high school, or whatever it is. That we need to be thinking about who is actually coming. I think so oftentimes we're like, well, I'm just going to preach the word, and we want to preach the word, but again, we want people to actually understand and be able to, respond to it. And I think sometimes if we just say, well, I'm just going to talk a certain way or speak however I want to speak, and sometimes we could be missing being more effective for people that are actually listening.
Yeah, so what if I haven't launched yet and I'm thinking, I don't really know who I'm going to be preaching to. I don't really know who's going to be showing. How do I kind of prepare?
Well, here's the great thing about this, is that as we're thinking, okay, who's actually coming? I mean, you can assume they're going to be, adults. Maybe you have kids in your service, however you do it, whatever. But you can assume who's coming. Is that you actually have a role to play to who actually shows up. And let me explain. So number 1, understand who you're preaching to will determine how you preach. So we need to be cognitive of who's coming. Yeah. And if you already have launched, like, what is the spiritual state of the people in your church? How many people, what types of people are coming? What is their work background? What do they connect with most? So for example, if you use a ton of example about parents with children, and let's say you have a older congregation and no one has young kids, or no one has kids yet. If every example you use is just about parents with kids, that might not resonate. Yeah, now, that's just one example.
It'd be tough to connect.
But you just got to understand who's coming so that you can speak to their situation. Which leads to number 2, you can actually have a role to play, and who do you actually want to preach to? So you can decide. Number 2 is decide who you actually want to preach to. Right. And whether you've launched yet or you've already launched, you can still do this. And here's what I mean, especially on a Sunday morning service gathering, which is what we're particularly talking about. Who is it that you want to reach? Now, I'm not necessarily going to say there's a right or wrong answer, but at New City Church, how we teach is we teach to believers knowing there are non-believers in the room. So, which that means is we teach the Bible, if you will, but we use the biblical words like atonement or sanctification, whatever. If that's in there, we use it, but we also then explain it. Because what happens is if you don't explain it and you just use, for example, big, deep theological words and you never explain the context of what's going on or anything like that, what will ultimately happen is you're going to end up with a bunch of people who know the Bible a lot. And that's kind of it. Which you want some of those people in your church, but I'm assuming you also want to reach non-believers and you want to help people grow in their faith. Yeah. And so you should preach the Bible. You can be deep if you want to, but you've got to explain words that may be more churchy that people don't understand. You want to explain context. So, recently we talked about the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. You could assume, which is a pitfall that sometimes we run into as preachers, that everyone already knows the context, so you just read it. Sure. And you don't explain who Lazarus is or who Mary and Martha is, his sisters, or Jesus. You don't even explain who Jesus is for the person. And so people either feel dumb or they feel like they don't fit in because they never understand what's happening. Yeah. And no one is actually going to verbally say, I don't understand. They're just going to assume everyone else knows what's happening, and it kind of makes them feel like, well, maybe this isn't for me. So you can actually decide and play a part in who you actually want to preach to. Yeah,
and I think you can go kind of too far the other way as well, of making it too, I don't know, we kind of use this word a lot, but too like seeker sensitive or too seeker friendly, where you're staying very surface level, and if someone's been in church, they're not getting anything either.
Kind of more of like, and not to knock it, but if you say, I want to be a church for people who don't like church, I'm always like, well, that's great. You want people that don't like church to come.
Sure.
But then what happens if they start to like it?
Right.
Right.
Like, yeah.
You kind of want both there. But you have a role to play. So again, New City Church, we preach to believers. We think the Sunday morning gathering is for believers. Knowing there's non-Christians that are going to come, we also want to preach so that our believers that do come can invite their friends.
Sure.
Because even if they understand what's going on, you want them to be thinking about their friends. And if they're like, my friends are not going to have any context or any clue about what's being said, you're not going to invite them.
Yeah, totally.
And so you actually have a role to play. Now, if you say you want to do, again, we're just using these kind of terms that maybe are not the most fair, but kind of people kind of know a little bit.
Yeah,
so
know what we're talking about.
If you want to be more seeker sensitive, if you will, I mean, I'm not going to dive into that, but let's just say that's, the kind of the more, for people that don't like church, that's fine. Then you got to structure your messages with that in mind.
Right.
All that to say is that you have a part to play in who you want to come, so you can decide, hey, do I want Christians to come? Do I want non-Christians to come? Who do I want to be here? And that changes how you preach, so you can communicate clearly to who you want to come.
Yeah. Yep.
And if you're sitting here and you're like, well, that's great, but maybe I'm in more an established church, or we've been here for a while, and there's a certain demographic of people, how do I get other different people to come? Here's point number 3. They all kind of go with each other, but point number 3 is how you preach affects who will come. So number 2 is you can decide who you want to preach to.
Yeah.
Why? Because point number 3, how you preach affects who will come. So if you're sitting here, for example, and maybe you're saying, well, we have a lot of Christians and we're a smaller church and I know everybody that's coming and there's no non-Christians are coming. It seems weird to me to explain things or to talk like there's no non-Christians here.
Yeah.
And what we would just say is that may feel weird at first, but what you will begin to do is a couple of things. One, everybody that's listening in at the church or at the gathering, they don't necessarily know everybody's story like you might.
Very true.
And so they will begin to assume, oh, there's non-Christians here, which is great.
Yep.
But also they'll be like, I love how you explained that. My friend needed to hear this.
Yeah.
Or this person needed to hear this. So let's say you've already launched and you're not starting from a clean slate. You can slowly change who comes. I mean, using that word just because we all know what that means.
Yeah.
By how you preach. Like you actually have a role to play. And I think sometimes we talked about this on this podcast before. I think what we called it the mythical bishop is how I heard it described.
Right. Yeah.
It's like we feel like we have to do certain things a certain way, not because we actually do, but because we kind of feel like that's just the way you're supposed to do it.
Yep.
And I think preaching falls into that sometimes. Like we feel like we have to preach a certain way, maybe for a certain length of time or using a certain type of outline or whatever, not knowing that there is some freedom in that and how we preach will affect who comes. And so if you want people to come, and we're not even talking about obviously you want to preach the Bible, but even like if there's a certain age demographic that you want to reach out to specifically, or a certain life stage, or people going through certain things, if you speak to that specific thing over time, you will begin to see people who that resonates with.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, I honestly I thought, and then it just completely slipped my mind. So I'll just let you continue.
I'll keep talking and maybe
right,
you can get that. But again, how you preach affects who will come, and it may seem awkward or it may seem like this is weird. Again, I'll use the example where there's no non-Christians.
Yeah.
But if you do it over time, people will begin to invite their friends, begin to say, oh, this is a great place for other people to come. And so how you preach makes a difference.
Yep. That's exactly what I was going to say. So thanks for jogging my memory with that. I was going to say is if you're in a place, and we've kind of been in this place kind of earlier on before we had a lot of newer people coming, where you kind of think everyone here knows what I'm talking about. Everyone knows the context. It does feel kind of awkward to explain it like you were saying. That's the biggest thing is what I was going to say is everyone that's there, even if you are in a room full of essentially Bible scholars, they all have friends that don't know what they're talking about, what you're talking about. So if you're talking just at a very high level and kind of making everything very complicated, like you're talking to a bunch of people who've been in church their whole life, it's going to be very intimidating for them to invite anyone.
Right. If you're speaking to like seminary students, then don't expect non-seminary students or people who don't or of that bent to come. I'll give you another example too about how you preach affects who will come. A non-spiritual example. It's very the tendency, especially for smaller churches, is, for example, to say people's name. So let's say like 50, and you can say, I was hanging out with John maybe for an example, I was hanging out with John last week and this happened. But people who don't know John will feel like, why do they say John? I don't know John. Everyone else knows John. Maybe I don't know someone I'm supposed to know. Maybe I'm not included, or I don't feel invited or included because I don't understand who John is, and it seems like everyone else does. And so we talked about this a lot, especially when we were smaller, when we launched, about how we don't use people's names, and if we do, we explain who they are. Yeah. But that's just another example of like when we're smaller, because it's harder to do when you're bigger. You kind of know, okay, not everyone knows this, but when you assume everybody knows everybody, and so you preach like everybody knows everybody, then it kind of it kind of subconsciously says, okay, we don't want new people here because they don't know everybody. Now, we don't want that to be the case, but that can happen if we're not careful about how we preach.
Yeah, and I've experienced that before, and it goes beyond names into like things that are kind of inside joke, like, you know, where like you said, it's really mostly just in a smaller church context. Once you get to a bigger church, they kind of know better, I guess. But I've been to smaller churches where they kind of there's a joke or something that's said that doesn't really make any sense to me as a new person, and half the congregation is laughing, and you're sitting there thinking like, I don't know. You're like, I'm definitely alienated being the only new person here. I feel like I'm the only new person here.
And that being said, I mean, sometimes there are things that happen in the life of your church that are funny that a brand new person wouldn't know. But that should be the exception. You shouldn't be getting up there, just as just one example, every week talking about insider things that no new person would have any context of, because then it makes them feel like they're not included, which determines who actually shows up.
Yeah, totally.
And we talk about this too. If you go to episode 3, so way back to the beginning, we talk about contextualizing to your target. At New City Church, we go hard after the young pro, kind of 25 to 30 age demographic, which affects a lot of the things that we do, but also some of our topics and some of the illustrations in our sermons. And so that's a good thing to do. I would go back to that episode and see, who do you really want to reach as a church? And I'll go through these reasons again. Number one, because understanding who you are preaching to will determine how you preach. So we need to know who's showing up so we can speak to them. Number two, if you want certain people to come, that you can decide who you want to preach to, because that affects who comes. And then number three, like we just said, how you preach affects who will come. So those are 3 reasons why you should understand your audience and not just say, I'm going to teach the Bible and be faithful. I know this is an extreme example, but if you teach the Bible in French and everyone that's coming is in English, they're not going to make sense. So if now you probably say, I speak English and everyone that's coming is in English, but you want to keep that mindset in mind. How can I make this as most as understandable to them as possible? So that needs to go into how we preach.
Right.
So thanks for listening. If you have questions about preaching or anything else about church planting or ministry, you can go to practicalplanting.com/questions. Submit a question. We'll answer it in a future episode. Thanks for being with us, and we'll see you next time on Practical Church Planting. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Practical Church Planting. Whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube or Practical Planting, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, make sure you like or subscribe or do whatever it's telling you to do or should do on that platform.
And hey, if you are so tired of looking at our ugly faces, but you're not tired of listening to our beautiful voices, then you can find our podcast if you just search Practical Church Planting on iTunes or Google Play. Make sure not to just find it, not just to listen, but to subscribe.
Make sure you subscribe. Brian, tell them to subscribe.
Subscribe.
See you next time.